History is more than just time gone by. It is the echo of power and courage, of ideas and intrigue. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the revolutions of the modern age, every era has its heroes, its shadows, and its secrets. We dive into the stories that changed the world, revealing what truly happened and what was never told. Welcome to Diary of History, where the past comes alive.
And we shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Freedom and justice, I have a dream.
Chapter 1, Introduction: Why the Soviet Union Shaped the World. The history of the Soviet Union is one of the most powerful and contradictory episodes of the 20th century. It includes not only the rise and fall of a state, but also the transformation of entire societies, the formation of new ideologies, and the confrontation with the West, which dominated world politics for decades. Between 1922 and 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR for short, existed as the first country to be openly founded on the ideas of Marxism-Leninism. It thus became a political, economic, and cultural alternative to the capitalist West, especially to the United States. The very existence of the Soviet Union called into question the capitalist world order. Millions of people around the world looked with hope or fear to this state, which tried to achieve social equality, industrialization, and education for all, but at the same time was characterized by repression, censorship, and violence. The Soviet Union experiment was thus both a promise and a threat. It produced unprecedented achievements, from the defeat of Nazism to space travel, and at the same time profound tragedies such as famines, political purges, and the oppression of entire populations. The USSR was unique in several respects. On the one hand, due to its sheer size, a multi-ethnic state stretched from Eastern Europe to the Far East, covering more than a sixth of the Earth's land area. Within its borders lived over 100 different nationalities, languages, and cultures. On the other hand, it was the power that dominated half of Europe after the Second World War and thus created the basis for the Cold War. For decades, the world was divided into two blocks, the Eastern Bloc under Soviet leadership and the West under U.S. dominance. This bipolar world order influenced not only politics, but also science, culture, sports, and even the everyday lives of people worldwide. Why is the history of the Soviet Union still important today? On the one hand, because many of the conflicts we are experiencing in the 21st century have their roots in this time. Russia's relationship with the West, its dealings with former Soviet republics such as Ukraine, Georgia, or the Baltic states, all this can hardly be understood without the Soviet past. On the other hand, because the Soviet Union was a gigantic social and economic experiment. It tried to turn a backward agricultural country into a modern superpower in a short time, with all the opportunities and risks that entailed. The consequences of this continue to shape the societies of the successor states to this day. The introduction is therefore intended to provide an overview of why the Soviet Union is not only a historical issue, but a key to understanding the modern world. In the following chapters, we will see how the Bolsheviks turned a revolution into a state, how this state maintained its power for decades, and finally collapsed under the pressure of internal contradictions. It will be a story full of drama, contradictions, and turning points. A story that shows how closely progress and oppression can be linked. The Soviet Union shaped the world through several factors. Ideologically, it represented the alternative to capitalism and inspired left-wing movements, parties, and liberation movements worldwide. Politically, As a permanent member of the UN and leading power of the Eastern Bloc, it was one of the two dominant superpowers for decades. Military. With its gigantic army and nuclear arsenal, it was the only state that could stand up to the USA. Scientifically, the Soviet Union produced enormous advances in technology, space travel, and education, which had a global impact. Culturally and socially, from literature to sports, the Soviet Union represented a world of its own that fascinated or deterred millions of people. It should not be forgotten that behind the big slogans stood the lives of millions of ordinary people. Peasants, workers, soldiers, artists, and intellectuals. Their stories bring the history of the Soviet Union to life, from the first days of the revolution to the horrors of Stalinism to the euphoria and disappointment of Perestroika. Chapter 2. Prehistory. Russia in the late Tsarist Empire. In order to understand the emergence of the Soviet Union, one must first take a look back at the last decades of the Tsarist Empire. At the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, Russia was an empire full of contrasts. On the one hand, a huge empire that had stretched from Poland to Alaska and still stretched from Eastern Europe to Asia. On the other hand, a country that was considered backward in many respects, economically, socially, and politically. The Russian Tsars ruled with absolute power, supported by a hierarchical social order in which the Orthodox Church and the nobility played a central role. The Tsar was understood as a godlike ruler whose will stood above all else. But in the shadow of this autocracy, deep social and political discontent grew, which would eventually lead to revolutions. Russia as a multi-ethnic empire. The Tsarist Empire was a patchwork of peoples, religions, and cultures. Only about half of the population was ethnically Russian. Millions of Ukrainians, Poles, Finns, Georgians, Armenians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and many others lived under the rule of the Tsar. On the one hand, this diversity was a strength, as it produced a huge empire with different resources. On the other hand, it was a weakness, as national movements in many regions sought autonomy or independence. The Tsars usually reacted with repression, Russification, suppression of languages and cultures, harsh police controls. This exacerbated tensions. Especially in Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, strong opposition to the Tsarist rule emerged. These conflicts were harbingers of the nationality question that would later also shape the Soviet Union. Economic backwardness and social tensions. At the end of the 19th century, Russia was lagging far behind the Western industrialized countries. While the Second Industrial Revolution flourished in Germany, Great Britain, and the USA with steel, electricity, and chemicals, Russia was still predominantly an agricultural country. About 80% of the population lived in the countryside, often in abject poverty. The peasantry was severely marked by serfdom, which was not abolished until 1861. Although the peasants were given formal freedom, the land divisions were inadequate, and many fell into new dependencies due to high taxes and debts. Hunger crises were frequent. At the same time, a small but growing workforce emerged in the factories in the cities, which had to work in extremely poor conditions. Long working hours, low wages, no rights. These social grievances created the breeding ground for revolutionary ideas. Socialist and anarchist movements found supporters in both classes, among workers as well as among the intellectual strata, who demanded a modernization of the country. Political structures, autocracy, and oppression. Politically, Russia was an autocracy without real co-determination. The Tsar had almost unlimited power, supported by a huge bureaucracy, the Okhrana secret police, and the military. Opposition members were persecuted, arrested, or sent into exile. The press was censored, political parties were banned. Nevertheless, different political currents formed underground. Liberal intellectuals called for a constitutional monarchy based on the Western model. Nationalists demanded independence or more autonomy, and radical socialists such as the followers of Marx and Engels wanted to overthrow the Tsarist rule through a proletarian revolution. First signs of reforms and resistance. In the late 19th century, there were attempts to modernize the empire. The government invested in the expansion of the railways, especially the Trans-Siberian Railway, which connected Europe with the Pacific. Foreign investors, especially from France and Belgium, brought capital into Russian industry. Modern industrial centers were built in cities such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Baku. But this modernization was accompanied by an intensification of social contradictions. A few large industrialists profited while the workers suffered catastrophic conditions. These tensions first erupted on a large scale during the Revolution of 1905. The trigger was the Lost War against Japan, 1904 to 1905, which revealed Russia's weakness. In St. Petersburg, thousands of workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace on January 9, 1905, to hand over a petition to the Tsar. However, the soldiers opened fire. The Bloody Sunday Massacre shook the country. In the months that followed, there were strikes, riots, and mutinies. The uprising on the warship Potemkin was particularly famous. The Tsar initially reacted with violence, but then promised reforms. The October Manifesto introduced a parliament, the Duma, for the first time. But the Duma's rights remained limited, and autocracy effectively persisted. Nevertheless, 1905 was a decisive moment. It showed that the Tsarist regime was vulnerable. The role of intellectuals and revolutionary movements. At the same time, political groups became radicalized. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, founded in 1898, split into two wings in 1903, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks believed in a broad, more democratic workers' movement and wanted gradual reforms. The Bolsheviks, under Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, on the other hand, demanded a tightly organized cadre party that would lead the revolution. In addition, there were also the social revolutionaries, who were particularly active in the peasantry and carried out terrorist attacks on government officials. The ideas of Marx, Engels, and later Lenin increasingly gained followers. They promised not only an end to Tsarist rule, but also social justice and the overcoming of poverty. In doing so, they addressed millions of people who suffered under the old system. Russia on the edge of the First World War. By 1914, the Tsarist Empire had stabilized only superficially. Economically, it was on the upswing, but the social contradictions were intensifying. Politically, it remained an autocracy with repressive structures. Nationality conflicts were brewing, and the revolutionary movements were gaining strength. The outbreak of the First World War was to change everything. Russia entered the war on the side of the Entente against Germany and Austria-Hungary. But the Russian army was poorly equipped, the infrastructure was inadequate, and the losses were enormous. Millions of soldiers were killed, millions more were wounded or taken prisoner. In the countryside and in the cities, hunger and hardship intensified. The catastrophe of the war finally shook the already battered Tsarist rule. The February Revolution of 1917 was the result, and it was to mark the beginning of a new era, the end of the Tsarist Empire and the rise of the Bolsheviks. The Russia of the late Tsarist Empire was a country of extremes, huge, diverse, rich in resources, and at the same time backward, repressive, and crisis-ridden. Social tensions, political repression, and unresolved nationality conflicts made the empire vulnerable to upheaval. The events of 1905 and the catastrophe of the First World War prepared the ground for the revolutions of 1917.
Chapter 3: The First World War and the February Revolution of 1917. When World War I broke out in the summer of 1914, the Russian Empire seemed determined to assert its role as a great power. The government under Tsar Nicholas II entered the war against the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, on the side of the Entente, France and Great Britain. Officially, Russia was supposed to stand by Serbia as the protecting power of the Slavs, but in reality, it was about preserving zones of influence and claiming to be taken seriously as a European superpower. Initially, there was a wave of patriotic enthusiasm in large parts of the population. Hundreds of thousands volunteered for the army, and many believed that this war would end short and victorious. But it soon became clear that Russia was neither militarily nor economically prepared for this war. The Russian army was huge in numbers but poorly equipped and insufficiently organized. There was a lack of modern weapons, uniforms, food, and even rifles. Often, two soldiers had to share a rifle, with one waiting until the other had fallen to take over his weapon. The military leadership was outdated and marked by intrigue and incompetence. The first defeats on the front against Germany, especially the catastrophic Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914, cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers and shook confidence in the army leadership. The supply situation inside the country deteriorated dramatically. The war demanded enormous resources, but Russia's infrastructure was weak, the railways overloaded and poorly organized. Millions of men were drafted, which paralyzed agriculture. In the cities, there was a shortage of food, heating material, and everyday goods. Hunger, inflation, and despair spread. While ordinary people were in need, the court in St. Petersburg, which was renamed Petrograd during the war for patriotic reasons, seemed to live in its own world. The Tsar and his family seemed aloof, unable or unwilling to cope with the crisis. In particular, the appearance of the mysterious itinerant preacher Grigory Rasputin at court caused resentment. Rasputin had gained great influence on Tsarina Alexandra through his supposed healing art against Tsarevich, who suffered from hemophilia. Many believed that he was manipulating politics, which further undermined the prestige of the monarchy. The nobility and officers saw the Tsar's court as a center of corruption, incompetence, and moral decay. The political opposition grew stronger. Since the Revolution of 1905, the Duma had existed as a consultative parliament, but it had hardly any power and was repeatedly dissolved or limited by the Tsar. During the war, liberal and moderate politicians demanded a greater say in order to improve the supply crisis and military organization. But Nicholas II clung to his autocratic power and rejected reforms. When he took over the personal supreme command of the army in 1915, he wanted to show strength, but in fact, he put himself in a hopeless situation. With every military failure, he was held directly responsible, while in Petrograd, the Tsarina and Rasputin were hated as rulers. The mood in the population changed. Strikes and protests increased, especially in the big cities, where workers had to toil in catastrophic conditions in the arms factories. Women stood in queues for hours to get bread, often returning empty-handed. There were more and more demonstrations which were suppressed by police and soldiers. But discontent also spread in the army. Many soldiers came from peasant families and wondered why they should fight and die for a regime that had nothing to offer them. Desertions increased, morale collapsed. In February 1917, the discontent reached its peak. The winter had been particularly harsh, the food shortage dramatic, inflation galloping. In Petrograd, women workers began protesting for bread and peace on International Women's Day. Within a few days, the demonstrations grew into mass uprisings. Factory workers stopped work, students joined in, and soon tens of thousands poured into the streets. The slogans were no longer directed only against the need, but directly against the Tsar. "Down with the war! Down with autocracy!" the people shouted. The police were brutal at first, but soon cracks appeared in the ranks of the law enforcement forces. Soldiers who were sent to bludgeon the demonstrators refused the order or defected to the insurgents themselves. Within days, the authority of the regime in Petrograd had collapsed. The Duma refused to be dissolved and formed a provisional committee. At the same time, workers and soldiers founded their own councils, the so-called Soviets, based on the model of 1905. The Petrograd Soviet in particular quickly gained in importance. Nicholas II, who was at the front, lost control. His advisors urged him to abdicate in order to prevent chaos and civil war. On March 2, 1917, the Tsar signed his certificate of abdication, not only for himself, but also for his son. This ended the centuries-old Romanov dynasty and autocracy in Russia. Power now fell into the hands of a provisional government, consisting mainly of liberal and moderate forces, promising to introduce a constitutional order and introduce democratic reforms. But the February Revolution not only produced a new government, but also a new form of dual power. In addition to the provisional government, there was the Petrograd Soviet, which had great influence on the workers and soldiers. While the government wanted to continue the war in order to keep its obligations to the Allies, the Soviets demanded peace, bread, and land. This split was to prove disastrous. At first, there was an atmosphere of euphoria. After centuries of autocracy, Russia seemed to be entering a new era. Newspapers were published freely, political prisoners were released, and parties and organizations were able to form openly. Many believed that a democratic future was now beginning. But at the same time, the fundamental problems remained unsolved. The war, the supply crisis, the land question. And in the shadow of these unresolved questions, one force was preparing for its decisive appearance, the Bolsheviks under Lenin, who returned to Russia in April after years of exile. Thus, the February Revolution marked the end of the Tsarist Empire, but not the end of the crisis. Rather, it opened a phase of upheaval in which various forces struggled for power. The population was full of hope and at the same time full of despair. The Soviets and the Bolsheviks gained influence, while the provisional government weakened. The storm that began in February was to escalate into a new revolution in October of that year, a revolution that would change the course of the world.
Chapter 4: The October Revolution and the Bolsheviks. The February Revolution had swept away the old Tsarist Empire, but it left a political vacuum. Russia now found itself in a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, the provisional government, composed of liberal and moderate forces, was in power. And on the other hand, there was an alternative power base in the Petrograd Soviet that exerted direct influence on workers, soldiers, and sailors. This dual power was unstable from the beginning. While the government tried to establish a democratic order, the reality was chaos, hunger, war, and growing radicalization. The provisional government had hardly any opportunities to meet the gigantic expectations of the population. Although it promised political freedoms, it refused to address the most pressing social problems. The land question remained unresolved, as an immediate redistribution of land was postponed until after the planned Constituent Assembly. For the farmers, who suffered from poverty and had hoped for land for generations, this was unsatisfactory. Even more serious was the question of war. The government wanted to continue the war on the side of the Allies in order to comply with international obligations and secure Russia's influence. But millions of soldiers and civilians longed for nothing more than peace. In this area of tension, the Bolsheviks increasingly stepped into the limelight. Their leadership was initially weakened, and many were in exile. But in April 1917, Lenin returned to Petrograd with the support of Germany. The famous April Theses, which he published immediately after his arrival, hit like a bomb. Lenin demanded all power to the Soviets, an immediate end to the war, the distribution of land to the peasants, and the socialization of industry. For many contemporaries, these demands seemed radical and unrealistic, but they struck a chord with the masses. While the provisional government was losing authority, the Bolsheviks began to expand their position. The months after February were marked by constant crises. In the summer of 1917, the military situation deteriorated dramatically. Russian offensives failed, the morale of the troops sank into the abyss, desertions increased.
In the hinterland, the supply crisis worsened, and workers went on strike en masse. Demonstrations in Petrograd escalated in July when tens of thousands took to the streets against the government. The so-called July Days ended with a suppression of the protests and a temporary weakening of the Bolsheviks, but they showed how explosive the mood had become. Lenin fled into exile in Finland, while other leaders of the party were arrested. Nevertheless, the movement remained strong, supported by a growing network of supporters in the factories, in the Soviets, and in the army. In August 1917, another crisis occurred. General Kornilov, commander-in-chief of the Russian army, attempted a coup to overthrow the provisional government and establish a military dictatorship. Prime Minister Kerensky saw this as an existential threat and turned to the Bolsheviks of all people for support. Bolshevik militias and workers defended the capital against Kornilov's troops, who eventually disintegrated. This moment strengthened the Bolsheviks decisively. They had presented themselves as defenders of the revolution and at the same time won the trust of many workers and soldiers. In the course of the autumn, the political situation became more radical. The provisional government was isolated, while the Bolsheviks gained influence in the Soviets. Especially in the Petrograd Soviet, they soon had a majority. Despite Lenin's temporary stay in hiding, he insisted incessantly on an armed seizure of power. He was convinced that an opportune moment had arrived. The government was weak, the population dissatisfied, the army demoralized. If you wait too long, other forces could fill the vacuum. In October 1917, at the beginning of November, according to the Western calendar, the Bolsheviks decided to dare an insurrection. Under the leadership of Leon Trotsky, who was now chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, a military revolutionary committee was formed. This organized workers' and soldiers' militias, the so-called Red Guards, and systematically prepared the seizure of power. Kerensky and the provisional government sensed the danger, but were unable to react decisively. In the night of October 25 to 26, the Bolshevik seizure of power began. It was surprisingly unspectacular. The Red Guards occupied strategically important points in the capital: railway stations, telegraph offices, bridges, banks, and government buildings. Resistance was minimal, and many soldiers refused to fight for the provisional government. The highlight was the capture of the Winter Palace, seat of government. The depiction of this action in later Soviet films, above all Sergei Eisenstein's October, made it seem like a heroic mass battle. In reality, it was a comparatively bloodless and chaotic episode that claimed hardly any victims. Kerensky himself fled the city. The other ministers were arrested. On October 26, at the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, the Bolsheviks announced the overthrow of the provisional government and the seizure of power. Lenin appeared before the delegates and declared that the workers' and peasants' government had been born. Congress immediately adopted the first central decrees: the Decree on Peace, which demanded an immediate armistice with all warring parties, and the Decree on the Land, which ordered the expropriation of the landed property of the large landowners in favor of the peasants. The Bolsheviks had seized power, but their position was by no means consolidated. Many other socialist parties, Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, rejected Bolshevik autocracy and left the Congress. This left the Bolsheviks isolated. Nevertheless, they managed to expand their control step by step. They relied on the Soviets, the workers' and soldiers' councils, which appeared to be democratically legitimized organs, but were in fact increasingly dominated by Bolsheviks. The events of October were the beginning of a radical transformation of Russia. In the months that followed, these changes were to deepen dramatically. The withdrawal from the World War, the Civil War, the founding of the Red Army, the crushing of political opponents. But as early as October 1917, the Bolsheviks' approach became apparent. Determined, organized, ready for violence, and convinced that they were acting in the name of a historic mission. The October Revolution was a shock for many contemporaries. The Western Allies saw their Russian front collapse. The liberals and moderates in Russia saw the coup as a betrayal, while millions of workers and peasants hoped that their demands for peace, bread, and land would finally be met. The Bolsheviks themselves soon staged the coup as a world historic event, the beginning of a new epoch in which the working class took power and shook the capitalist world order. In retrospect, it is clear that the October Revolution was not only a Russian event. It had global significance. It inspired communist movements worldwide and made the Bolsheviks a symbol of radical change. At the same time, it laid the foundation for a rule that was soon to be consolidated through authoritarian structures, violence, and repression. But in the autumn of 1917, in the chaotic days after the fall of the provisional government, the belief in a new future initially prevailed. Chapter 5: The Civil War and the Founding of the USSR. With the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks had seized power in Petrograd, but their victory was only the beginning of a long and bloody conflict. Russia plunged into a civil war that devastated the country from 1918 to 1921 and claimed millions of victims. The Bolsheviks faced enormous challenges after coming for power. Although they had the capital and large sections of the working class on their side, the rural regions, large parts of the army, and political opponents did not accept their rule. In addition, the old elites, monarchists, officers, liberals, and social revolutionaries were by no means prepared to resign themselves to the loss of their positions. The first step of the new government was the Peace of Brest-Litovsk. In order to end the war immediately, Lenin concluded a treaty with Germany in March 1918, which cost Russia huge territories, including Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. Millions of people were cut off from Russia as a result, and economically the losses were devastating. For Lenin, however, it was a necessary decision. He believed that the revolution had to be saved, whatever the cost. Many contemporaries perceived the peace as a betrayal, and it strengthened the rejection of the Bolsheviks by other political forces. Soon after, a broad alliance was formed against the Bolsheviks. A wide variety of opponents gathered under the name of the Whites: monarchist officers, liberal politicians, moderate socialists, and nationalists from the outskirts of the former Reich. They were ideologically divided, but united in one goal: to overthrow the Bolsheviks. On the other side were the Reds, the supporters of Soviet power, organized in the newly formed Red Army under the leadership of Leon Trotsky. Trotsky proved to be a brilliant organizer, molding a powerful army out of a crumbling bunch of soldiers and volunteers. He introduced strict discipline, appointed political commissars to ensure loyalty to the party, and was prepared to act with extreme severity against deserters or opponents. The Civil War was not a classic war between two fronts, but a chaotic mixture of regional uprisings, guerrilla fights, international interventions, and national liberation movements. Several centers of the white movement emerged: in the south under General Denikin, in the east under Admiral Kolchak, in the northwest under General Yudenich. In addition, foreign powers intervened to contain Bolshevism. British, French, American, and Japanese troops landed in various regions, officially to secure supply routes and protect prisoners of war, but in fact also to make life difficult for the Reds. The Red Army had the advantage of controlling the center of Russia, the densely populated areas around Moscow and Petrograd, with the main industrial centers and railway lines. The Whites, on the other hand, were geographically dispersed and politically fragmented. Their leaders could not agree on a common program, and many of their troops abused the population, looting and spreading terror. The Bolsheviks exploited these weaknesses for propaganda purposes and presented themselves as defenders of ordinary people. The Civil War was marked by incredible brutality. Both sides committed atrocities, but the Bolsheviks developed a system of political repression that became known as the Red Terror. The Cheka, the secret police, carried out mass arrests, shootings, and hostage-taking in order to stifle any opposition. Those who were suspected of being counter-revolutionaries risked their lives. Often, a loose word or membership of another party was enough. At the same time, the Bolsheviks imposed so-called war communism. Private companies were nationalized, peasants were forced to deliver their harvests, trade was banned. These measures were intended to secure supplies for the cities and the army, but led to hunger, chaos, and uprisings. In many regions, peasants rose up against the Bolsheviks, especially dramatically in the Ukraine and in Tambov, where entire villages were burned down by Red Army soldiers. Despite these tensions, the Bolsheviks managed to gain the upper hand. Between 1919 and 1920, they repelled the attacks of the White armies one after the other. Kolchak in the east was captured and executed, Denikin had to flee to the west, Yudenich failed at the gates of Petrograd. The foreign intervention troops also withdrew, as their home countries were tired of war and had hardly any resources left for adventures in Russia. In the end, the Reds were victorious, although at the price of unprecedented devastation. According to estimates, between 7 and 10 million people died in the Civil War, through fighting, hunger, disease, and terror. Entire regions were in ruins, the economy had collapsed, and the population was exhausted. In 1921, a new phase began. Lenin realized that war communism had brought the country to the brink of the abyss. Famines killed millions, agriculture was on the ground. In Kronstadt, an important naval base, loyal sailors rose up against the Bolsheviks and demanded more democracy and freedom, an uprising that was brutally suppressed but revealed the weakness of the regime. In this situation, the leadership decided to correct course, the new economic policy, or NEP for short. It again allowed limited private trade, small farms, and incentives for farmers to sell surpluses. This was intended to stabilize the economy without calling into question the Bolshevik monopoly of power. At the same time, political consolidation began. On December 30, 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially founded. It initially consisted of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia. Later, other republics were added. Formally, the Soviet Union was an association of equal states, but in fact, the Russian center dominated. The Bolsheviks, who now called themselves the Communist Party, had power firmly in their hands. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and other leaders organized the new state in which the party and government were inseparable. The founding of the Soviet Union was the result of years of struggle and sacrifice. It marked the beginning of a state that claimed to be the world's first socialist society. Millions of people at home and abroad saw it as a symbol of hope, while others saw it as a threat. The Civil War had shaped the face of the new order, a radical ideology, enforced by force, supported by a strict party and a powerful secret police, but also supported by the belief that something completely new was being built. When the USSR came into being, it was still weak, devastated, and isolated. But the foundations had been laid, and the coming years were to show how this state would develop, between promises and terror, between construction and oppression. The Civil War had hardened the Bolsheviks and convinced them that only iron discipline and force could ensure the survival of their revolution. This experience shaped the entire further history of the Soviet Union. Chapter 6: Lenin's Rule and the NEP Experiment. When the Soviet Union was officially founded in 1922, it was still on weak legs. The Civil War had drained the country. Millions had died. The economy was on the ground, and confidence in the future had been shaken in many places. It was in this difficult situation that Lenin, the undisputed leader of the Bolsheviks, became the center of the new state. His rule in the years leading up to his death in 1924 was decisive in how the foundations of the Soviet Union developed. It was marked by the consolidation of power, the attempt to revive the economy, and the constant tension between revolutionary ideals and pragmatic survival. Lenin had understood the October Revolution as a radical break with the past, but reality forced him to compromise again and again. The Civil War and war communism had shown that pure ideology could not feed the country. Millions of people suffered from hunger, uprisings, and coercive measures. In particular, the famine of 1921, which was exacerbated by drought, war, and compulsory levies, led to a humanitarian catastrophe that claimed millions of victims. The situation was also dramatic in the cities. Factories were at a standstill, workers fled to the countryside to survive, and industrial production was at a fraction of pre-war levels. In this desperate situation, Lenin made a decisive decision. Instead of risking Bolshevik rule, he introduced the new economic policy, or NEP for short. It meant a radical change of course. Farmers were again allowed to keep surpluses and sell them at markets. Small and medium-sized enterprises could be run privately, and trade was partially allowed again. However, the state retained control over major industries, banks, foreign trade, and infrastructure. This mixture of state control and limited private capitalism was intended to stabilize the country without calling into question the political power of the Bolsheviks. The NEP was in many ways a concession to reality. It was criticized by radical Bolsheviks who saw it as a betrayal of socialist principles. Lenin himself spoke of a tactical retreat, a kind of strategic pause on the road to socialism. But the effect could not be denied. Within a few years, the economy recovered. Farmers began to cultivate their fields again, trade revived, and small shops, restaurants, and craft businesses sprang up in the cities. These NEP men, as they were called, soon became the symbol of a new, semi-capitalist lifestyle, which, however, also caused social tensions. Politically, however, the situation remained authoritarian and repressive. The Communist Party retained the monopoly on power. Opposition parties were banned, and the secret police, now called the GPU, monitored society. Within the party itself, factions were suppressed and dissent was dangerous. Lenin did everything he could to preserve the unity of the party because he knew that only a united leadership could hold the fragile Soviet Union together. At the same time, he was convinced that the revolution in Russia would not survive if it was not supported at some point by revolutions in other countries. He had high hopes for the spread of socialism in Europe, especially in Germany, but the failed uprisings there in the early 1920s made it clear that Russia would initially remain alone. Lenin's rule was also characterized by the treatment of nationalities. The Soviet Union consisted of numerous republics and peoples whose loyalty was by no means self-evident. Lenin sought to portray the Union as a voluntary union of equal republics to refute the accusation of Russian imperialism. Formally, each Soviet republic was recognized as independent with the right to withdraw. In practice, however, power remained concentrated in Moscow. Nevertheless, this federal system laid the foundation for what would later become a multi-ethnic state, which, however, also broke up in 1991. The years of the NEP were also a time of intense cultural and social experimentation. There was a spirit of optimism in the cities, which was reflected in literature, art, theater, and film. Avant-garde currents such as constructivism flourished. Writers and directors experimented with new forms, and the idea of creating an entirely new socialist culture inspired many intellectuals. At the same time, education and literacy were massively promoted. Millions of people who had never attended school before now learned to read and write. The Soviet Union wanted to create an educated society that could support socialism. But while a new cultural life grew in the cities, the country continued to be characterized by poverty and backwardness. The peasantry remained suspicious of Bolshevik rule. Although the NEP brought some relief, the experience of coercive measures during the Civil War was deep-seated. Many farmers saw the party as a threat rather than an ally. These tensions were to flare up again later in the conflicts over collectivization. Lenin's last years were overshadowed by illness. From 1922 onwards, he suffered several strokes, which made him increasingly unable to act. While he was physically deteriorating, the battle for his succession was already raging within the party. Joseph Stalin, in particular, who had been appointed general secretary of the party, took the opportunity to expand his position. Lenin himself had doubts about Stalin's character and methods. In his so-called testament, a letter to the party Congress, he warned against Stalin and recommended that his power be limited. But after Lenin's death in January 1924, this will was largely ignored, and Stalin began to assert himself step by step. Lenin's rule left behind an ambivalent legacy. On the one hand, he had founded the Soviet Union, stabilized the economy with the NEP, and formed a new society in rudimentary form. On the other hand, his rule was marked by violence, oppression, and the establishment of a party dictatorship that tolerated no dissent. He had shown that the Bolsheviks were prepared to use any means at their disposal to stay in power, an attitude that was to determine the subsequent history of the Soviet Union. The NEP was a breather after years of war and chaos, but it was never intended to be a permanent solution. Lenin saw it as a temporary compromise until the Soviet Union was strong enough to further expand socialism. After his death, the question arose as to which path the country would take: the pragmatic course of the NEP or a renewed push for radical change. The answer was to be given by Stalin in the years to come, and it was to shape the face of the Soviet Union for decades. Chapter 7: The Rise of Stalin. Power Struggles After Lenin's Death. When Lenin died in January 1924, the young Soviet Union was in many ways a fragile entity. The economy had stabilized as a result of the new economic policy, but the country was still characterized by backwardness and poverty. Politically, power was firmly concentrated in the hands of the Communist Party, but the question of who should take over the leadership after Lenin was open. Lenin had left no clear succession plan, and his will, in which he warned of the dangers of too great a concentration of power with Stalin, was kept under lock and key by the party leadership. This opened up space for an intense power struggle in which different currents and personalities faced each other. Joseph Stalin, who had established himself as general secretary of the party in the years before, was by no means the undisputed favorite at first. Many comrades regarded him as a sober organizer, as someone who held the party together, but not as a great theoretician or orator. His rivals, above all Leon Trotsky, were considered far more brilliant and charismatic. Trotsky was the hero of the revolution, organizer of the Red Army, and a dazzling figure who was also admired internationally. In addition, there were other important leaders such as Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin, all of whom had their own supporters and struggled for influence. However, Stalin was a master at using his inconspicuous position. As General Secretary, he controlled the party's personnel policy, determined appointments and promotions, and thus built up a network of loyal supporters. While other comrades shone in ideological debates, Stalin worked in the background, filling key positions with confidants and ensuring that he was always informed about the currents within the party. This power base soon proved decisive. The first major conflict after Lenin's death revolved around the question of the course of the Soviet Union. Trotsky advocated the theory of permanent revolution. He was convinced that socialism could not survive on its own in a backward country like Russia, and that only an international spread of the revolution, especially to Europe, could save the Soviet Union. Without the victory of the proletariat in more advanced countries, Trotsky argued, the Soviet experience was in danger of failing or degenerating. Stalin countered this with the theory of socialism in one country. He argued that the Soviet Union could also carry out socialist construction independently of world events. This position was more pragmatic, addressed the need for stability, and found broad support in the ranks of the party. First, Stalin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev formed an alliance to isolate Trotsky. They portrayed him as an arrogant intellectual who wanted to split the party, and recalled his former opposition to Lenin. Trotsky gradually lost his supporters and was forced out of central positions. In 1927, he was finally expelled from the party and sent into exile, first to Kazakhstan and later abroad. This eliminated Stalin's most dangerous rival. But Stalin did not rest on his laurels. He soon turned against his former allies Zinoviev and Kamenev. Together with Bukharin, he had meanwhile formed a new majority. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had once fought on his side against Trotsky, were now branded as the opposition. Stalin knew how to portray them as unreliable and disloyal until they too were ousted from the centers of power. The next confrontation was directed against Bukharin and the so-called right opposition. During the NEP, Bukharin and his supporters had advocated a policy of cautious modernization. They wanted to give the peasants time to increase their production and were against forced collectivization too quickly. Stalin, however, began to distance himself from the NEP. He argued that the Soviet Union had to be more industrialized in order not to be threatened again by external enemies. To this end, it is necessary to squeeze the peasantry more strongly and collectivize agriculture. In making this change of course, he portrayed Bukharin as a brakeman and defender of the kulaks, the wealthier peasants. This opposition was also gradually eliminated. By the end of the 1920s, Stalin had eliminated all rivals. Trotsky was in exile, Zinoviev and Kamenev were ousted, Bukharin was marginalized. Stalin stood as the undisputed leader of the party and the state. His power was based not only on his control of the party, but also on his ability to flexibly change ideological positions, form alliances, and break them at the decisive moment. He was neither the brilliant theorist nor the charismatic orator, but he proved to be a master of power politics, intrigue, and manipulation. At the same time, the climate within the party also changed. During Lenin's time, there had still been some debates, albeit under strict control. Under Stalin, tolerance for dissenting opinions declined rapidly. Criticism was increasingly seen as a danger. Opposition groups were crushed, and the party developed more and more into an instrument of personal rule. The atmosphere was one of mistrust and fear, as no one knew when they could be targeted by the leadership. The rise of Stalin was not only an internal party phenomenon, but had profound consequences for the entire Soviet Union. With his theory of socialism in one country, he gave the population a goal that seemed achievable: the construction of a powerful state that could exist independently of the West. At the same time, he paved the way for a policy that relied on rapid industrialization, forced collectivization, and the massive use of force. His power, which he gained in the years after Lenin's death, was the cornerstone of the system that would later become known as Stalinism. Lenin's death had ushered in a new era. What had initially seemed like an open competition between different ideas and personalities ended within a few years with the autocracy of one man. Stalin succeeded, step by step, through skillful power games, brutal repression, and the building of a loyal apparatus, in eliminating his rivals and making the party his tool. This paved the way for the most radical restructuring of the Soviet Union since the revolution, a restructuring that transformed the country into an industrial superpower in the 1930s, but also brought immeasurable suffering to millions of people.
Chapter 8: Collectivization and Industrialization. At the end of the 1920s, the Soviet Union was at a crossroads. After years of new economic policy, some stability had returned. But in the eyes of Stalin and many party officials, this stability was deceptive. The Soviet Union remained economically backward by international standards, especially in industry. Western states had modern technologies, developed heavy industry, and far greater military clout. It was clear to Stalin that if the USSR wanted to survive and not be in danger again as in the First World War or the Civil War, it had to catch up within a very short time. He put it drastically: either the Soviet Union would overtake the capitalist countries in a few decades, or it would be crushed by them. Out of this conviction, Stalin initiated a radical transformation that shook society to its foundations. Two main goals were at the heart of this restructuring: forced industrialization and the collectivization of agriculture.
With the so-called five-year plans, the Soviet Union began to organize its economy according to plan and centrally controlled. The first five-year plan, which came into force in 1928, relied on the massive promotion of heavy industry: steel, coal, iron, mechanical engineering, and energy production. Factories that had hardly existed before were now to be built on a gigantic scale. Entire cities were rebuilt or expanded to serve as centers of industrial production. Examples such as Magnitogorsk, a newly built steel city in the Urals, or the Dnieper Dam in Ukraine symbolize the enormous ambitions of this project. Industrialization changed the country within a very short time. Millions of peasants were lured into the cities or forcibly resettled to be employed as workers in the factories. People's everyday lives changed fundamentally. While they had previously lived in traditional structures in the countryside, they now found themselves in a new world of machines, factory pipes, shift work, and dormitories. For many, this meant an enormous burden. But at the same time, the propaganda promised a bright future in which the Soviet Union would overtake the West and create a truly socialist society. Parallel to industrialization, Stalin pursued a second, no less radical goal: the collectivization of agriculture. For the Bolsheviks, the peasant economy, based on small-scale peasant property, was an obstacle on the road to socialism. In addition, industrialization urgently needed food for the urban population and raw materials such as grain for export in order to be able to buy machinery and technology from abroad. The solution presented by Stalin and his followers was forced collectivization. Peasants were to give up their individual farms and work in large collective farms, the kolkhozes, or in state-owned enterprises, the sovkhozes. The implementation of this policy was brutal. Especially the so-called kulaks, wealthier peasants, were treated with severity. They were branded as class enemies, expropriated, deported, or executed. In reality, it affected not only wealthier farmers, but also countless middle and poorer families who refused to hand over their land and animals to collective ownership. Entire villages were depopulated. Millions of people were deported to remote regions such as Siberia. Resistance to collectivization was fierce. Peasants slaughtered their cattle instead of giving them up and refused to work on the collective farms. The consequences were devastating. The violent enforcement of collectivization led to a dramatic slump in agricultural production. In Ukraine in particular, there was a terrible famine in the early 1930s, which became known as the Holodomor. Millions of people died of hunger. Entire regions suffered from shortage and misery. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to export grain in order to obtain foreign currency for industrial development. This contradiction shows how ruthless Stalin's policy towards the population was. Despite the human catastrophes, industrialization achieved impressive successes. The production of steel, coal, oil, and machinery multiplied within a few years. New branches of industry emerged that hardly existed before. The Soviet Union made a leap in a very short time that had taken other countries decades. Cities grow rapidly, a new working class emerged, and society was modernized at a pace unprecedented in history. For many people, especially young workers, industrialization also offered opportunities: advancement through education, new technical professions, and the opportunity to participate in the construction of a completely new state. Propaganda played a central role in this. The five-year plans were celebrated in gigantic campaigns, posters and films praised the successes, and heroes of the work, the so-called Stakhanov movement, were to be role models for the masses. The miner Alexis Stakhanov, who allegedly fulfilled many times the normal norm, was celebrated as a symbol of the new socialist worker. Such stories motivated many to improve their performance, even if they were often exaggerated or staged. But the reality behind the plans was harsh. Working conditions in the new factories were catastrophic. Safety standards were scarce and supplies inadequate. Workers lived in overcrowded barracks, suffered from hunger and disease, and those who did not meet the norms risked punishment. The gigantic projects devoured enormous resources, and the population paid the price in the form of deprivation and suffering. A project of enormous scale, Magnitogorsk, a newly built steel city in the Urals, or the Dnieper Dam in Ukraine, symbolize the enormous ambitions of this project. Industrialization changed the country within a very short time. Millions of peasants were lured into the cities or forcibly resettled to be employed as workers in the factories. People's everyday lives changed fundamentally. While they had previously lived in traditional structures in the countryside, they now found themselves in a new world of machines, factory pipes, shift work, and dormitories. For many, this meant an enormous burden, but at the same time, the propaganda promised a bright future in which the Soviet Union would overtake the West and create a truly socialist society. Parallel to industrialization, Stalin pursued a second, no less radical goal, the collectivization of agriculture. For the Bolsheviks, the peasant economy, based on small-scale peasant property, was an obstacle on the road to socialism. In addition, industrialization urgently needed food for the urban population and raw materials such as grain for export in order to be able to buy machinery and technology from abroad. The solution presented by Stalin and his followers was forced collectivization. Peasants were to give up their individual farms and work in large collective farms, the kolkhozes, or in state-owned enterprises, the sovkhozes. The implementation was brutal. Especially the so-called kulaks, wealthier peasants, were treated with severity. They were branded as class enemies, expropriated, deported, or executed. In reality, it affected not only
Chapter 9: The Great Terror and Stalinism. The 1930s were not only a time of rapid industrial development for the Soviet Union, but also an era of fear in which millions of people fell victim to state repression. The so-called Great Terror, which reached its peak between 1936 and 1938, was an unprecedented system of persecution, mass arrests, show trials, and executions. He shaped not only the political culture of the Soviet Union, but also the relationship between state and society for decades. The terror was closely linked to the personality of Stalin, whose power was finally consolidated during this period and whose rule became synonymous with Stalinism. Even before that, the Soviet leadership had repeatedly used violence to secure its power. The Civil War, forced collectivization, and war communism had shown that the Bolsheviks were prepared to take radical action against their opponents. But what happened in the 1930s went far beyond these methods. It was not just a question of eliminating political rivals, but of systematically permeating all sectors of society with a climate of mistrust, control, and fear. The Great Terror began with the so-called show trials. Between 1936 and 1938, several staged trials took place in Moscow, during which leading Bolsheviks of the early hour, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and others, were publicly accused and executed. They were accused of conspiracies with foreign powers, sabotage, and plans to assassinate Stalin. The charges were largely absurd, but the defendants confessed, often after months of torture or psychological pressure. The trials were widely followed at home and abroad, and were intended to give the impression that the Soviet Union was threatened by internal and external enemies. In reality, they served to eliminate any possible opposition within the party and to establish Stalin as an untouchable leader. Parallel to these high-profile cases, the repression spread to the entire society. The NKVD secret police organized mass arrests, in which people were often picked up arbitrarily. A denunciation system ensured that anyone could be suspicious: colleagues, neighbors, friends, or even family members.
One wrong word, a joke about the leadership, an old connection to an enemy of the people, all this could be enough to be targeted by the authorities. The prisoners were convicted in summary trials, often without evidence, and were either shot or deported to the network of labor camps, the Gulag system. The Gulag became a symbol of Stalinism. Millions of people went through this system of penal camps, which stretched across the entire country, from the Arctic to Central Asia. The prisoners were forced to work hard under inhumane conditions, in the construction of canals, roads, and railways, in mines, or in the timber industry. Hunger, cold, and disease claimed countless victims. At the same time, the camps made a significant contribution to economic development as they provided cheap labor. For those affected, however, the Gulag system meant the loss of their freedom, often their lives, and for society as a whole, the constant fear of being drawn into it. The terror affected not only ordinary citizens, but also the elites. The military was plagued by purges, in which a large part of the generals were executed or imprisoned. Especially against the backdrop of the looming threat of Nazi Germany, this was catastrophic, as the Red Army was deprived of its most experienced commanders. Scientists, artists, and intellectuals were also targeted. Many had to subordinate their work to the official line. Others disappeared into camps or were executed. The culture of the 1930s was characterized by censorship and enforced conformity. Only the line of socialist realism promoted by the state was permitted. The causes of the Great Terror are manifold. On the one hand, it served to secure Stalin's power. By eliminating all potential rivals, even those who had long since ceased to pose a real threat, he was able to make his position unassailable. On the other hand, the terror was an expression of an ideology that suspected enemies of socialism everywhere, and believed that the revolution had to be constantly defended. Added to this was Stalin's deep distrust of anyone who did not appear to be completely loyal. Terror was thus both a political instrument and the product of a paranoid worldview. Society was deeply shaped by this atmosphere. People lived in constant uncertainty. Trust between neighbors, colleagues, or even within the family had become dangerous, as denunciations were commonplace. At the same time, a culture of adaptation developed. In order to survive, people repeated the official slogans, took part in rituals such as demonstrations, and tried not to attract attention. This adaptation did not always mean real conviction, but it strengthened the system and made resistance more difficult. Despite the horror, the regime managed to legitimize terror as part of a larger narrative. Propaganda portrayed the Soviet Union as a besieged fortress surrounded by enemies who wanted to destroy socialism. Anyone who expressed doubts was considered a potential traitor. This narrative linked the victims to a supposedly higher goal, the defense and construction of socialism. Many people who suffered nevertheless held on to the hope that their sacrifices had a purpose and that the Soviet Union was on the right track. By the end of the 1930s, Stalin had consolidated his power more than any other Soviet leader before. The price was immeasurable: millions of deaths, a traumatized society, a destroyed culture of open discussion. But the system that emerged from terror was stable. The party was completely riddled with loyalists, the army purged, society intimidated. When World War II began in 1939, the Soviet Union was a centralized organization whose population was accustomed to discipline, sacrifice, and obedience. The Great Terror was not simply an episode of violence, but a structural element of Stalinism. He showed how the regime worked through a combination of ideology, propaganda, fear, and violence. This combination made the Soviet Union both strong and vulnerable. Strong because it had enormous mobilizing power. Vulnerable because it was based on the destruction of trust and individual freedom. The shadow of terror was to accompany the Soviet Union until its end, even if it later continued to exist in a weakened form.
Chapter 10: The Second World War, the Great Patriotic War.
When World War II began in 1939, the Soviet Union was in an ambivalent position. On the one hand, it was a country that had become a great power through industrialization and forced modernization in the 1930s. On the other hand, society was shattered by terror and mistrust. The army was weakened by the purges, and trust in the leadership was damaged. Stalin and the party leadership had built up a huge armaments industry, but the officer corps of the Red Army was decimated by the mass arrests and executions. In this situation, Stalin pursued a foreign policy that was concerned with gaining time and tactical advantage. The Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939 was the most spectacular sign of this policy. The non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany surprised the world, as both regimes were ideologically considered mortal enemies. But Stalin and Hitler had pragmatic reasons. Stalin wanted to gain time to further arm the Soviet army and at the same time hoped for territorial gains. The secret additional protocol of the pact provided for the division of Eastern Europe into zones of influence. Germany attacked Poland from the west, the Red Army invaded from the east, and the country was divided between the two powers. At the same time, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states and parts of Romania. The attack on Finland in the Winter War of 1939–40 was also one of these expansionist steps, even if it was embarrassing for the Red Army and caused high losses. This phase of cooperation with Germany came to an abrupt end on June 22, 1941, when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union with Operation Barbarossa. The German invasion was the largest campaign in history, with millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks and planes. The Soviet Union was completely surprised, despite warnings from Western intelligence services. Stalin had ignored the reports of an imminent attack because he did not want to believe in a breach of the pact. The result was a catastrophe. In the first few weeks, the German Wehrmacht penetrated deep into Soviet territory. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were taken prisoner. Entire fronts collapsed. The first months of the war were marked by chaos, panic, and unimaginable losses. Millions of Soviet soldiers were surrounded and captured. Many of them died in the camps of the Wehrmacht. Cities such as Kiev, Minsk, and Smolensk fell, and the German troops were soon on the outskirts of Leningrad and Moscow. Leningrad was besieged from 1941 to 1944, during which time hundreds of thousands of civilians starved to death. The population survived under inhumane conditions, but stood firm. In Moscow, the fall of the capital seemed imminent in the winter of 1941, but the Soviet counteroffensive, supported by freshly brought troops from Siberia and the Far East, brought the Wehrmacht to a standstill. The myth of the invincibility of the German army was broken. From that moment on, a war began that was waged not only militarily, but also ideologically and existentially. For the Soviet Union, it became the Great Patriotic War, a struggle for bare survival. The years 1942 and 1943 marked the decisive turning points. In the south, the Wehrmacht attacked the oil fields of the Caucasus, while at the same time trying to reach the city of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad developed into one of the most cruel and symbolic battles of the war. For months, fighting raged in the ruins of the city. Streets and houses became battlefields. The population suffered from bombing, hunger, and cold. But the Red Army held out and launched a counteroffensive in the winter of 1942–43, which surrounded the German Sixth Army. On February 2, 1943, the survivors surrendered. Stalingrad became the turning point of the war. For the first time, the Wehrmacht suffered a crushing defeat, and the Red Army's self-confidence grew. Another key event was the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in history. The Germans tried to break through the Soviet lines with a large-scale attack, but the Red Army was prepared. The attack failed, and the Soviet Union finally went on the offensive. From that moment on, she pushed the Germans back step by step. Parallel to the military struggle, the Soviet population had to make enormous sacrifices. The war was total. Every area of life was geared towards victory. Millions of men were drafted, women worked in factories, children collected metal and wood. Entire factories were moved to the east and rebuilt there under primitive conditions. Propaganda called for patriotic resistance, and Stalin himself became a symbolic figure who embodied resistance. Paradoxically, it was the man who had spread fear through terror and repression who was now celebrated as the father of the people. The losses were enormous. It is estimated that around 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire regions were devastated, villages burned down, millions of people deported or murdered. The German occupiers waged a war of annihilation, especially in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia itself. The Jewish population fell victim to the mass shootings of the Einsatzgruppen. Many others were deported to forced labor. The war was marked by brutality, hunger, and misery, but it also created a tremendous cohesion that ultimately made victory possible. From 1944 onward, the Red Army pushed the Germans back from Soviet territory and invaded Eastern Europe. Cities such as Minsk, Warsaw, Budapest, and finally Berlin were conquered by Soviet troops. In May 1945, Soviet soldiers hoisted the red flag on the Reichstag, a symbol of victory over Hitler's Germany. For the Soviet Union, this victory was of the utmost importance, not only militarily but also morally. It had played the main part in the defeat of Nazi socialism, paid the highest price in blood, and proved its role as a world power. The Great Patriotic War became the central myth of the Soviet Union. It served as proof of the strength of the socialist system, a source of national pride, and a justification for the geopolitical expansion that followed in the post-war years. At the same time, he left deep wounds, millions of destroyed families, devastated cities, and a country that, despite the victory, was facing a huge reconstruction. But this victory consolidated Stalin's power more than ever. The man who had shaped the country through terror and coercion was now also the leader under whom the Soviet Union had triumphed.
Chapter 11. Victory over Hitler's Germany and the division of Europe. When the red flag flew over the Reichstag in Berlin in May 1945, the Soviet Union had reached the height of its power and prestige. The victory over Hitler's Germany had made the country, which only a few years earlier had been marked by destruction, hunger, and fear, one of the two leading world powers. But this triumph had been bitterly bought. Millions of deaths, burned cities, bled villages, and a society that had endured immeasurable suffering. The war had deeply shaped the Soviet Union, but it had also strengthened it politically and militarily. Now the question arose as to how Europe should be reorganized after the victory over Nazi Germany, and the answer to this question led to the division of the continent. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war with enormous prestige. It had played a major role in the defeat of the Third Reich, suffered more losses than any other country, and at the same time showed that it was capable of maintaining a formidable war machine despite all the catastrophes. For many people in the West, especially among left-wing movements, the USSR now became a symbol of sacrifice, strength, and the triumph of socialism. At the same time, however, fear prevailed in neighboring countries because the presence of the Red Army in Central Europe made it clear that the Soviet Union also made territorial and political claims. During the war, the Allies had already discussed the post-war order at conferences in Tehran, 1943, Yalta, February 1945, and Potsdam, July 1945. It became clear that the Soviet Union knew how to assert its interests consistently. Stalin demanded security guarantees for the Soviet Union, which had been invaded several times from the West in the past. In his view, this meant that the countries of Eastern Europe should be under Soviet influence in the future in order to serve as a buffer zone against future threats.
Churchill and Roosevelt, later Truman, accepted this reality in part, as they needed Soviet help in the war and at the same time wanted to maintain cooperation with Stalin. The immediate consequence of the Soviet advance was the establishment of governments in Eastern Europe that were oriented towards Moscow. In Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union used its military presence to bring communist parties into government and weaken opposition forces. At first, this was often done under the guise of coalitions, but it soon became apparent that the communist forces supported by Moscow were gaining the upper hand. Within a few years, the political systems of these countries were reshaped according to the Soviet model. At the same time, the reorganization of Germany began. The defeated country was divided into 4 occupation zones, which were controlled by the USA, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin itself was also divided, although the city was deep in the Soviet zone. Initially, it was still unclear whether Germany would exist as a unitary, neutral state or whether it would disintegrate into rival blocs. But the antagonisms between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies quickly deepened. Questions such as the amount of reparation payments, the political order, and the economic organization led to irreconcilable differences. While the West relied on reconstruction that would also reintegrate Germany into the international community, the Soviet Union insisted on harsh reparations and strict controls to prevent a resurgence. Tensions between East and West also increased because both sides had completely different ideas about society and politics. In the Western countries, democracy was restored, albeit with restrictions, while in the Soviet-controlled areas, one-party systems based on the Bolshevik model were established. The press was brought into line, opposition members were persecuted, and societies were geared step by step towards a socialist future. This development was not a spontaneous result, but part of Stalin's clear strategy to permanently secure the Soviet sphere of influence. For the population of the Eastern European countries, this meant a radical upheaval. Old elites were disempowered, industry and banks were nationalized, land reforms were carried out, and political opponents were eliminated. Many initially welcomed the end of fascism and war, but soon disillusionment spread when it became clear that the new order did not bring real freedom but a different form of control. Nevertheless, the Soviet leadership presented this process as liberation and progress, as part of the worldwide struggle against imperialism and capitalism. The division of Europe was thus effectively sealed, even if it had not yet been officially declared. The term Iron Curtain, coined by Winston Churchill in a speech in 1946, described the new reality. On the one hand, there was the West, with its democratic capitalist societies. On the other side, the East, with the socialist regimes under Soviet domination. This division was to determine the political, economic, and cultural life of the continent for decades. For the Soviet Union, the victory over Hitler's Germany meant not only security, but a tremendous increase in power. It now had a direct influence on the fate of millions of people outside its borders. At the same time, the outcome of the war was the basis for the USSR to become a superpower that, together with the USA, determined world politics. The seat on the United Nations Security Council, the prestige of victory, and control over Eastern Europe made it a central player in the new order. But this triumph was riddled with contradictions. The country itself was marked by destruction. Entire cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure was destroyed. Agriculture devastated. Reconstruction was a daunting task, and the population continued to suffer from deprivation. Stalin took advantage of this situation to consolidate discipline and further expand the system of planned economy. Although the war had strengthened the position of the Soviet Union, it had also created new dependencies, especially in Eastern Europe, where the presence of Soviet troops remained necessary to secure influence. The victory over Hitler's Germany was thus a double legacy.
It brought pride and legitimacy, but also the responsibility and burden of controlling a new empire. For the Soviet Union, the war became the central myth of its identity. The Great Patriotic War was glorified in monuments, films, literature, and rituals. It was the heart of Soviet historical consciousness. At the same time, he laid the foundation for the Cold War, as the differences between the victorious powers soon became irreconcilable. The division of Europe was not the result of a sudden decision, but the result of the development of the war and the political logic after 1945. The Soviet Union had brutally asserted its security interests consistently, and at the same time created the basis for a system that would last for 4 decades. It was now the undisputed hegemonic in the East, but this status also brought with it new conflicts and confrontations that would soon engulf the entire world.
Chapter 12. The Cold War Begins. When the cannons of the Second World War fell silent, the world had not come to rest. Rather, a new epoch began that was to determine the fate of all humanity in the coming decades. The Cold War. It was not a direct military conflict between the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, but a global conflict for power, influence, ideology, and security that affected almost all areas of life. For the Soviet Union, it was, on the one hand, a confirmation of its newly won status as a world power, and on the other hand, a permanent challenge that devoured enormous resources and kept society in constant tension. The roots of this conflict were already in the Second World War. Although the Western powers and the Soviet Union had worked together in the anti-Hitler coalition, their alliance had always been marked by mistrust. While the West interpreted the war as a struggle for democracy and freedom, the Soviet Union understood it as an existential struggle for survival, from which it emerged with the claim not only to guarantee its security, but also to spread its own ideology. The advance of the Red Army had changed the political map of Europe, and in the territories liberated by it, Moscow began to install communist governments, or at least to ensure the communists' seizure of power. The United States and its Western partners saw this development as a clear indication of Soviet expansionism. The situation in Germany, in particular, became a touchstone. While the Western zones relied on economic reconstruction, the Soviet Union insisted on high reparations and strict control. The differences quickly led to a rupture, and the division of Germany became a symbol of the greater division of the continent. The blockade of Berlin in 1948-49, when the Soviet Union tried to starve the western part of the city, and the airlift of the Western powers that ensured supplies, marked a first climax of the confrontation. But the Cold War was much more than a conflict over territory. It was a clash of two worldviews. The Soviet Union presented itself as the leading power of socialism, as an alternative to the capitalist system, which it presented as exploitative and imperialist. It supported communist parties around the world, established contacts with trade unions and liberation movements, and presented itself as a pioneer of the international working class. At the same time, it tried to organize the reconstruction of its own country after the devastating war. The planned economy was further centralized, and gigantic resources flowed into the arms industry to secure the military balance with the United States. On the other hand, the United States saw it as its task to contain the spread of communism. With the Truman Doctrine of 1947, they officially declared that they wanted to resist wherever free peoples were threatened by communist movements or Soviet pressure. The Marshall Plan, a huge aid program for the reconstruction of Europe, was a further step toward stabilizing Western societies and integrating them permanently into the capitalist system. For the Soviet Union, this was nothing more than an attempt to limit its own influence, which is why it prevented the Eastern European countries from joining and instead created its own economic alliance with the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or CMEA. The division of Europe was thus finally cemented. On one side was the West with its democratic capitalist systems, on the other, the East with the people's democracies controlled by Moscow. The founding of NATO in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact in 1955 also manifested this division militarily. The Cold War was not only a conflict between states, but a systemic conflict that shaped the thinking and actions of entire societies. For the Soviet Union, the beginning of the Cold War was a paradoxical situation. On one hand, it was able to expand its sphere of influence considerably. From East Germany to Bulgaria, governments were in power that directly or indirectly followed Moscow. The USSR had become a hegemonic power over an entire bloc that encompassed a third of Europe. On the other hand, this victory came at a high price, because securing this position required a military presence, economic support, and constant control to prevent deviations. It became apparent early on that Eastern European societies were not always prepared to accept Soviet tutelage without resistance. The nuclear dimension intensified the threat. In 1945, the USA had demonstrated its military superiority by dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union followed suit and tested its first atomic bomb in 1949. This marked the beginning of an arms race that was to become the central feature of the Cold War. Both sides invested enormous sums in ever more powerful arsenals of weapons, and mutual deterrence, the so-called balance of terror, became a guarantee that the conflict would not escalate into a direct world war. For the population, however, this meant a life in the shadow of the nuclear threat that could conjure up the destruction of civilization at any time. At the same time, a worldwide competition for influence developed. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the Soviet Union supported anti-colonial movements and communist parties, while the United States supported authoritarian but anti-communist regimes. The Cold War was thus not limited to Europe, but became a global conflict that affected almost all corners of the world. For the Soviet Union, this offered an opportunity to spread its ideology on the one hand. On the other hand, it meant an enormous burden as it had to direct resources to distant regions. Inside the Soviet Union, the Cold War intensified the tendency to control and repression. Any criticism could be interpreted as Western infiltration, and loyalty to the party became more than ever a condition for social security. At the same time, the regime used the conflict to invoke national unity. The victory in the Great Patriotic War was linked to the new confrontation. Just as the Soviet Union had defeated Hitler, it must now also defeat the imperialist West. But the population paid a high price. The reconstruction after the war was arduous, housing was scarce, consumer goods rare. While an economic miracle began in the West, Soviet society suffered from a shortage economy. The resources flowed into heavy industry and the military, not into people's everyday life. Nevertheless, hope for a better future remained, nurtured by propaganda and pride in the Soviet Union's role as a world power. The beginning of the Cold War thus was not a sudden break, but a gradual escalation that was nurtured by ideological antagonisms, geopolitical interests, and mutual mistrust. For the Soviet Union, it was both a curse and a blessing. It secured it the status of a superpower, but also forced it into permanent competition that was to burden its society and economy for decades.
Chapter 13. Life under Stalinism, Everyday Life, Culture, and Control. Life in the Soviet Union during Stalin's rule was marked by profound contradictions.
On the one hand, a state emerged that made tremendous industrial progress, almost eliminated illiteracy, strengthened the role of women in many areas, and won the war against Hitler's Germany. On the other hand, fear, oppression, and lack prevailed and permeated daily life. For millions of people, everyday life was a constant balancing act between adaptation and survival, between loyalty to the system and one's own needs. The everyday life of ordinary people was strongly influenced by the planned economy. Food, clothing, and many other everyday goods were scarce and often only available through long queues. Rationing systems determined access to bread, meat, or sugar, and supplies were highly dependent on political priorities. While immense funds flowed into heavy industry, the military sector, and the construction of monumental projects, consumer goods production remained neglected. Housing was scarce, and many families lived in cramped communal apartments, the so-called komunalkas, in which several families shared kitchens and bathrooms. There was hardly any privacy, and conflicts with neighbors could quickly become dangerous, as denunciations to the authorities were possible at any time. At the same time, the state tried to ideologically shape the population. Propaganda was omnipresent in newspapers, radio, films, textbooks, and posters. Stalin himself became the object of a huge personality cult. He appeared in depictions as a wise leader, father of the nation, brilliant strategist, and infallible leader. His portraits hung in factories, schools, and homes. Speeches and quotations were memorized, and public life was permeated with rituals that emphasized his veneration. Birthdays, anniversaries, and political celebrations repeatedly offered the opportunity to demonstrate loyalty to the father of the nations. Culture was brought into line by allowing only socialist realism as a form of artistic expression. Art, literature, and film had to glorify the achievements of socialism, portray the working class heroically, and celebrate the victory of the collective over the individual. Works that deviated from this or were considered formalist were banned, and their creators were ostracized or persecuted. At the same time, however, impressive works of art were created that capture the spirit of the era. Films by Sergei Eisenstein, monumental buildings in Moscow, or the music of Dmitri Shostakovich reflected the creative power of Soviet culture on the one hand and its subordination to ideology on the other. Education and science occupied a prominent position during this period. Illiteracy, which had been widespread in the Tsarist Empire, was overcome in a very short time. Schools and universities were massively expanded, and children from working-class and peasant families gained access to higher education for the first time. The natural sciences and technology in particular were promoted, as they were decisive for industrialization and the military strength of the country. At the same time, these areas were also subject to political control. Research had to be in line with ideology, and deviations could become dangerous, as the example of the pseudoscience of the Lysenko doctrine promoted by Stalin shows, which had devastating consequences in agriculture. Social life was strongly influenced by collectivism. Leisure, work, and politics merged. Organizations such as the Komsomol, the Youth League, formed the next generation in the interests of the party. Sports festivals, marches, and mass events shaped the public space. Those who got involved could gain social recognition, but it was also obligatory to participate in such activities. The individual became a cog in a huge social machine, the goal of which was the construction of socialism. The role of women also changed fundamentally during this time. Women were more integrated into the world of work, working in factories, on construction sites, and in agriculture. The state propagated equal rights, but in practice, many women had to bear the double burden of gainful employment and family responsibilities. The birth rate was boosted by pro-natalist measures, divorce was made more difficult, and abortions were temporarily banned. The official ideology celebrated the heroine of work as well as the mother of many children, which made clear the contradictory demands on women. Above all was the omnipresent fear of repression. The memory of the Great Terror, the presence of the secret police, and the constant possibility of arrests shaped the consciousness of the people. Many developed strategies of adaptation. They adhered to the official slogans, took part in political rituals, and tried not to attract attention. But even under these conditions, forms of community and solidarity emerged, whether in families, neighborhoods, or at work. People helped each other, tried to create small free spaces, and developed an everyday life that remained worth living despite all the hardships. The war had also shaped everyday life. The pride in the victory was great, but the losses were felt everywhere. Millions of families had lost loved ones, many veterans returned wounded. The reconstruction was a huge undertaking that demanded a willingness to make sacrifices. At the same time, the leadership used the war to further consolidate the loyalty of the population. The Great Patriotic War became the central myth that was repeatedly invoked in monuments, films, and celebrations. It served as proof of the strength of the socialist system and as a basis for legitimizing Stalin's rule. The everyday life under Stalinism thus meant existing in a system that on the one hand had enormous mobilizing power, but on the other hand almost completely suppressed individual freedom and security. People were part of a society that was permanently in a state of struggle and construction, fighting against internal and external enemies, building a new world that would give meaning to all deprivations. Many actually believed in this future, others endured it with resignation, and still others tried to go their own way in secret. Stalinism shaped generations of Soviet citizens. He created a society that was characterized with education, industrialization, and collective organization on the one hand, but on the other hand was marked by fear, adaptation, and subordination. This experience left deep traces that were to continue to have an effect even after Stalin's death. Everyday life under Stalinism was a life between hope and fear, between progress and oppression, a reflection of the contradictions that permeated the entire Soviet system.
Chapter 14: Khrushchev's Thaw and the Cuban Missile Crisis. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, he left behind a country that was one of the two superpowers of the world on the one hand, but on the other hand, marked by terror, oppression, and economic backwardness. Millions of people breathed a sigh of relief when the news of his death was announced, because with him, an era of constant fear ended. But the question of how to proceed was open. A power struggle immediately began in the party leadership, in which a collective leadership model initially emerged. Malenkov, Beria, Molotov, and others tried to exert their influence, but soon Nikita Khrushchev, the first secretary of the Communist Party, prevailed as the new strongman. It marked the beginning of a phase that would later become known as the thaw, a cautious departure that was to free the country from the heaviest shackles of Stalinism, but without completely questioning its basic structures. The decisive turning point came in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress of the CPSU, when Khrushchev broke with the personality cult around Stalin in a secret speech. He denounced the crimes of terror, the mass murders, the show trials, and the destruction of millions of lives. This speech, which was initially reserved for a narrow circle, spread quickly and triggered shock waves throughout the country and in the international communist movement. For the first time, it was publicly admitted that Stalin had not been the infallible hero that propaganda had portrayed him as. For many, this was a moment of liberation, but also of uncertainty. Entire worldviews began to falter, and trust in the party was put to the test. De-Stalinization did not mean a renunciation of socialism, but a relaxation of the repressive system. Many political prisoners were released from the camps, the secret police lost some of their omnipotence, and censorship was relaxed somewhat. Literature, film, and art experienced a certain opening. Works that had previously been banned could appear, and a new generation of writers and intellectuals began to reflect more cautiously on reality. A change was also noticeable in people's everyday lives. The ever-present horror of arrest diminished, and the atmosphere was less fearful than before. Khrushchev also relied on economic reforms. He wanted to strengthen agriculture, which had suffered under Stalin's policies, and launched the New Land campaign, in which huge areas in Kazakhstan and Siberia were reclaimed. Initially, this measure was successful, but soon ecological and organizational problems also became apparent.
In industry, Khrushchev tried to detach the focus somewhat from the pure heavy industry model and to promote the production of consumer goods. Refrigerators, televisions, and simple cars became available to parts of the population, and the standard of living slowly rose. Nevertheless, the planned economy remained inflexible in many areas, and the supply situation was still often inadequate. Internationally, the Khrushchev era was characterized by a mixture of confrontation and détente. On the one hand, he relied on a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. He explained that a direct war between the superpowers no longer made sense in view of the threat of nuclear annihilation. Instead, the competition between socialism and capitalism was to be fought out in the economic, scientific, and cultural fields. On the other hand, the rivalry with the U.S. remained fierce, and both sides continued to arm. The Soviet Union tested hydrogen bombs, developed intercontinental ballistic missiles, and presented itself as an equal military power. A highlight of this competition was the beginning of the space age. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world when it sent the first artificial satellite into space, Sputnik 1. 2 years later, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. These successes were celebrated worldwide as proof of the superiority of the Soviet system and strengthened the self-confidence of the population. At the same time, they concealed the continuing economic weaknesses and supply problems in everyday life. But the thaw brought not only hope but also new tensions. In the Eastern European satellite states, de-Stalinization triggered expectations that soon led to uprisings. In 1956, students and workers rose up in Hungary to demand not only democratic reforms, but also withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. The uprising was bloodily suppressed by Soviet tanks, thousands of people died, and hundreds of thousands fled abroad. This event showed the limits of the thaw. The Soviet Union was willing to allow some liberalization, but as soon as its dominance in Eastern Europe was called into question, it responded with violence. The international situation escalated dramatically in the early 1960s. The climax was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. After the U.S. attempted to isolate revolutionary Cuba politically and economically, the Soviet Union saw an opportunity to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere. Khrushchev secretly stationed medium-range missiles on the island, which were within range of numerous American cities. When U.S. spy planes discovered the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy responded with a naval blockade and demanded immediate withdrawal. For days, a nuclear exchange of blows seemed imminent. Only after intense negotiations, Khrushchev gave in and declared his willingness to dismount the missiles, while the U.S. in return promised not to invade Cuba and to withdraw its missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point. It showed the limits of Soviet power and damaged Khrushchev's reputation at home and abroad. Many in the Soviet leadership saw his policies as risky and unpredictable. At the same time, the crisis was a signal that nuclear escalation could only be avoided through negotiations. This was followed by a phase of cautious détente, symbolized by the hotline, a direct communication link between Washington and Moscow, and by the first arms control agreements. Internally, however, Khrushchev's support dwindled. His reforms did not bring the breakthroughs he had hoped for. Agriculture remained inadequate, and his impulsive nature alienated many officials. In 1964, he was finally ousted from power by his colleagues and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev. This ended the phase of the thaw, but the traces it left behind could not be ignored. The Khrushchev era was a time of awakening and ambivalence. It brought a certain liberalization and the first cautious steps away from the excessive methods of Stalinism. It was at the same time a phase of pride in scientific and technological successes, but also of disillusionment in the face of the limits of the planned economy. Internationally, it led to a dangerous escalation that brought the world to the brink of catastrophe, and at the same time to the first beginnings of understanding. The thaw was thus a transition, a moment between the leaden heaviness of Stalinism and the later stagnation under Brezhnev, a moment in which the Soviet Union briefly seemed as if it could actually renew itself. Chapter 15, Brezhnev Era, Stability or Stagnation. When Leonid Brezhnev succeeded Nikita Khrushchev in 1964, an era began that would last almost 2 decades and deeply shape the Soviet Union. Unlike his impetuous predecessor, Brezhnev was a man of continuity, a functionary who understood the apparatus and whose strength lay in his ability to find compromises within the party elite. Under his leadership, the Soviet Union initially stabilized, both politically and economically, but this stability soon transitioned into a phase that many historians call stagnation. The Brezhnev era became synonymous with stagnation, incrustation, and the slow solidification of a system that had lost its dynamic power. At first, the change of power was a relief for many. Khrushchev's impulsive decisions, his unpredictable foreign policy, and the often poorly planned reforms had aroused mistrust among the party leadership and the population. Brezhnev presented himself as a calm, predictable leader who promised no experiments but reliability. In the first years of his rule, he succeeded in consolidating the party, stabilizing the economy, and placing relations with the West on a cautious basis of cooperation. Economically, the Soviet Union initially benefited from a phase of growth. Agriculture, which had long been the problem child, was temporarily strengthened by investments and better organization. Industry also continued to develop, and the population saw a noticeable, albeit modest, increase in living standards. Apartments were built, consumer goods such as televisions, refrigerators, or simple cars were now available to more people. This development led to a sense of contentment and advancement that was quite common in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But behind this facade, the system began to solidify. Although the planned economy was able to achieve certain goals, its structural problems became increasingly apparent. Innovative strength was lacking, as companies had no incentives to work more efficiently or to introduce new technologies. Production was carried out according to planning specifications that were often unrealistic, so either inferior goods were produced or figures were falsified. The result was a growing gap between aspiration and reality. Officially, the Soviet Union presented brilliant progress, but in everyday life, people continued to stand in long queues in front of shops looking for scarce goods. The Brezhnev era was characterized by a policy of social security. The state guaranteed work, housing, education, and medical care, which meant security and stability for many people. At the same time, however, this policy led to an atmosphere of convenience and disinterest. Since no one had to fear for their existence, motivation waned. Corruption, sloppiness, and inefficiency increased. The party apparatus in particular inflated. Functionaries often remained in their positions for decades. Personal loyalty was more important than competence, and the Soviet ruling class froze in a web of privilege and complacency. In foreign policy, the Brezhnev era marked a phase of intense confrontation and, at the same time, a limited détente. On the one hand, the Soviet Union continued its policy of expansion. In 1968, the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia was crushed by Soviet tanks after the reform government under Alexander Dubček tried to create socialism with a human face. Brezhnev justified this action with the so-called Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that the Soviet Union had the right to intervene in socialist countries if socialism was endangered there. This doctrine made it clear that Moscow was not willing to allow political freedoms in its sphere of influence. On the other hand, the Soviet Union tried to improve relations with the West. In the 1970s, the phase of détente began. Arms control treaties such as SALT I were signed. Trade relations intensified, and the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe led to the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, in which both sides recognized principles such as the inviolability of borders, but also human rights. This was a diplomatic success for the Soviet Union, as it effectively accepted its post-war order. At the same time, the emphasis on human rights provided dissidents in the Eastern Bloc with a new basis for articulating their demands. The Brezhnev era was also marked by growing military strength. The Soviet Union achieved parity with the United States in the field of nuclear weapons in the 1970s, and its army was the largest in the world. However, this military claim to power devoured enormous resources that would have been urgently needed to modernize the economy. While the West moved forward with the development of new technologies, computers, and modern industrial production, the Soviet Union lagged behind in many areas. The priority given to armaments and heavy industry led to a neglect of the consumer sector and increased the discontent of the population. Internally, the political climate remained controlled, although less brutal than under Stalin. Dissidents such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov drew attention to human rights violations and demanded reforms. They were persecuted, exiled, or placed under house arrest, but the terror of the 1930s was not repeated. Rather, an atmosphere of censorship, surveillance, and tacit adaptation developed. Many people withdrew into their private lives, cultivated their own small free spaces, and came to terms with the restrictions. Towards the end of the 1970s, it became increasingly clear that the system had reached its limits. Economically, growth stagnated, productivity fell, and the supply situation deteriorated. The oil boom of the early 1970s, which had provided the Soviet Union with enormous revenues through rising prices, could only temporarily mask the structural problems. When revenues declined, the weaknesses became obvious. The Brezhnev era was thus a paradox. It brought stability and relative security, but this stability was based on stagnation and a lack of renewal. It secured the status of a superpower for the Soviet Union, but it failed to lay the foundations for long-term modernization. For many Soviet citizens, this period was a period of predictability, in which they knew what to expect. No major catastrophes, but also no great hopes. But beneath the surface, a crisis grew that was to erupt openly in the 1980s. Chapter 16: Afghanistan, Dissidents, and the End of the Policy of Détente. At the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union found itself in a contradictory situation. To the outside world, it continued to present itself as a military superpower on an equal footing with the United States and with a vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. Internally, however, society suffered from the consequences of economic stagnation, the rigidity of the political system, and a growing gap between aspiration and reality. The Brezhnev era, which had initially brought stability, had entered a phase of inertia. The leadership had grown old, the party had become encrusted, and new ideas hardly had a chance. In this context, a conflict escalated that was to cause lasting damage to the international position of the Soviet Union, the war in Afghanistan. In 1979, the Communist People's Democratic Party seized power in a coup in Afghanistan, but its rule was unstable. Internal conflicts, the radical implementation of reforms, and resistance by traditional elites led to chaos and violence. When the situation got out of control and there was a danger that a pro-Western or Islamist government could emerge, the Soviet leadership decided to intervene. On December 24, 1979, Soviet troops marched into Afghanistan, officially to support the friendly government. In reality, it was an attempt to secure geopolitical influence and prevent a strategic loss in the southern sphere of influence. The operation quickly turned into a nightmare. The Soviet army faced a guerrilla war led by the Mujahideen, who were supported by the US, Pakistan, China, and Saudi Arabia. The fighters knew the difficult terrain, enjoyed the support of the population, and could count on supplies from abroad. What was intended as a brief intervention dragged on to a nearly decade-long war that claimed enormous casualties. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers died, hundreds of thousands were wounded, and the images of fallen young men returning home in zinc coffins shocked the Soviet population. The war was soon dubbed the Vietnam of the Soviet Union and undermined the regime's legitimacy. Parallel to the Afghanistan war, domestic tensions intensified. Dissident movements, which had already begun in the 1960s, gained in importance. Intellectuals such as Andrei Sakharov, the physicist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, criticized the lack of freedom, human rights violations, and the arms race.
Writers such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn drew attention to the reality of the camps and terror with their works. Although the regime continued to crack down on these voices, surveilling them, arresting them, or sending them into exile, it has not been able to completely silence the growing criticism. With the signing of the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, the Soviet Union had formally pledged respect for human rights, which dissidents now used as the basis for their demands. This development met a society that was increasingly frustrated. The lack of consumer goods, the poor supply of food, corruption in the party apparatus, and the apparent gap between official propaganda and real life led to a creeping alienation. Many people withdrew into the private sphere, devoted themselves to their families, their dachas, or the shadow economy, which made survival easier in the form of barter and black market. At the same time, the desire for change grew among younger generations, even if it could not yet be openly articulated. Internationally, the Afghanistan War led to a dramatic deterioration in relations between East and West. The phase of détente that had been marked by agreements such as SALT I and the Helsinki Final Act in the 1970s collapsed abruptly. U.S. President Jimmy Carter reacted to the Soviet invasion with tough measures, economic sanctions, the boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games in Moscow, and increased support for the Afghan resistance movement. With Ronald Reagan's inauguration in 1981, the confrontation intensified even further. Reagan described the Soviet Union as an evil empire and initiated a massive rearmament that took the arms race to a new level. The 1980s thus became a time of the Cold War in its most aggressive form since the 1960s. The stationing of new medium-range missiles in Europe, massive military maneuvers, and the construction of a missile defense system by the USA, the so-called SDI program, exacerbated tensions. The Soviet Union tried to keep up, but its economy was no longer able to bear the gigantic expenses for armaments and war. While the Western economies were able to rely on technological innovation and flexibility, the Soviet planned economy remained cumbersome and unproductive. Internally, the rigidity of the system became increasingly apparent. The party leadership was outdated. Brezhnev himself had been ill since the late 1970s and was hardly able to act. But little changed at his top, and after his death in 1982, two other old men, Andropov and Chernenko, followed, who only remained in office for a short time. This phase of political stagnation became a symbol of the exhaustion of the system. Reforms were urgently needed, but no one dared to do them as long as the old structures persisted. At the same time, unrest in the satellite states increased. In Poland, the trade union movement Solidarność emerged as a broad opposition that demanded not only better working conditions, but also political freedoms. The movement led by Lech Walesa gained millions of members and seriously challenged the rule of the Communist Party. Although the Polish government cracked down on martial law in 1981, the Soviet Union hesitated to intervene directly militarily for fear of international consequences. Nevertheless, the example of Poland showed that Moscow's control over Eastern Europe had become fragile. The combination of a war with heavy losses, a frozen economy, growing domestic protest, and the intensification of the Cold War led the Soviet Union into a deep crisis. On the outside, it still seemed to be a superpower, but on the inside, it was a colossus with feet of clay. The war in Afghanistan became a symbol of this crisis, an endless conflict that devoured resources, cost lives, and undermined the credibility of the regime. At the end of the Brezhnev era and in the years of his successors, it became increasingly clear that the Soviet Union was no longer able to meet the challenges of the time. The policy of détente had failed, the arms race intensified, and the dissident movement found more and more resonance, even if it was still suppressed. The Soviet Union was at a point where the old mechanisms no longer worked, but new solutions were not yet visible. Thus, the phase of apparent stability ended in a crisis that could no longer be ignored. The Afghanistan War, the dissident movement, and the end of the policy of détente marked the harbingers of an upheaval that was to begin in the 1980s with Gorbachev's seizure of power.
Chapter 17: Gorbachev, Perestroika, and Glasnost. When Mikhail Gorbachev became head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in March 1985, the country was gripped by a deep crisis. The economy stagnated. The planning specifications were routinely embellished. Agriculture could not adequately supply the population, and there was a chronic shortage of shops. Millions of people stood in long lines every day to get their hands on basic foodstuffs, while the elite enjoyed privileges that remained unattainable for ordinary citizens. At the same time, the arms race with the U.S. devoured gigantic resources. The war in Afghanistan continued, and the moral authority of the system was severely damaged by corruption and rigidity. Society seemed exhausted, apathetic, and without faith in the future. In this situation, Gorbachev seemed to many like a beacon of hope, young, dynamic, eloquent, and determined to change things. From the beginning, Gorbachev knew that fundamental reforms were needed to make the Soviet Union competitive again. His key term was Perestroika, which literally means transformation. This meant a comprehensive process of economic, political, and social renewal. Unlike earlier attempts at reform, Perestroika was not only intended to make adjustments to individual adjustments, but to modernize the entire system. At the same time, he relied on Glasnost, the openness. It meant a hitherto unimagined transparency in public life, the promotion of freedom of expression, and a cautious democratization of society. Together, Perestroika and Glasnost were supposed to free the country from its lethargy and give it a new perspective. In the economy, Gorbachev began cautious liberalizations. Companies should be given more responsibility. Efficiency should be increased through market-based elements. Collectives and companies were sometimes allowed to decide for themselves about their production and keep profits. Private initiatives on a small scale, for example in the service sector, were permitted. Agriculture should be stimulated by more incentives, and the eternal shortage of consumer goods should be gradually overcome. But these measures were slow to take effect and met with resistance from a bureaucratic elite that saw its privileges threatened. At the same time, Gorbachev focused on political reforms. It relaxed censorship, allowed for freer discussion in the media, and gave intellectuals the opportunity to talk about issues that had previously been taboo. Suddenly, articles appeared in newspapers and magazines about environmental pollution, corruption, crimes in the Stalin era, or the catastrophic state of the economy. Millions of people who had been accustomed to an artificial reality for decades experienced a shock. The silence was broken, and a wave of criticism swept through the country. Many saw this as liberating, but at the same time, the openness undermined trust in the system, which had previously been built on repression and myth. A dramatic example of the new transparency was the handling of the Chernobyl disaster in April 1986. The reactor accident in Ukraine had devastating consequences, but at first the leadership, as in earlier times, tried to cover up the truth. However, it soon became clear that this was impossible in the face of international attention. Under the pressure of Glasnost, the government had to disclose information, and millions of people experienced for the first time that the state was incapable of protecting its citizens. Chernobyl became a symbol of the deep crisis of the system and, at the same time, of the need for reforms. Gorbachev's policies also had an effect on the outside world. He realized that the Soviet Union could not win the arms race with the United States. The gigantic arms spending overwhelmed the economy, and a new conflict, such as the stationing of American missiles in Europe, threatened to ruin the country completely. That's why he relied on détente and cooperation. He held several summits with U.S. President Ronald Reagan, which culminated in the INF Treaty of 1987, the first treaty to abolish an entire category of nuclear weapons. This policy brought Gorbachev international prestige and the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990. But while he was celebrated abroad, he encountered growing difficulties at home. The economic reforms did not lead to immediate improvements, but initially exacerbated the problems. The old planning mechanisms no longer worked. The new market mechanisms were not yet established. The result was a chaotic transition. Shelves remained empty, inflation set in, and the supply situation worsened. For many people, Perestroika did not mean prosperity, but new deprivations. At the same time, Glasnost raised expectations that went far beyond Gorbachev's intentions. Nationality conflicts, which had been suppressed for decades, broke out. In the Baltic republics of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, mass movements demanded independence. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, conflicts flared up over Nagorno-Karabakh, and in Georgia and Moldova, movements against Moscow arose. In Russia, too, the feeling that the Union was too dominated by the central bureaucracy in Moscow gained in importance. The openness that Gorbachev wanted to create led to the diversity of interests, cultures, and political currents become visible, and the empire began to crumble. In the political structure, Gorbachev introduced reforms that amounted to democratization. In 1989, partially free elections to the Congress of People's Deputies were held for the first time. Opposition candidates were able to run, and the population took the opportunity to elect critical voices. Figures like Boris Yeltsin gained popularity and openly questioned the authority of the party leadership. The Communist Party lost its monopoly position, and the political system began to change fundamentally. For many Soviet citizens, this was a time of hope and euphoria. Newspapers reported on topics that had long been concealed, literature and film flourished, and millions of people took part in discussions about the future of the country. At the same time, however, uncertainty grew. The old system disintegrated without a new one taking its place. Factories produced less, shops were empty, and inflation ate up savings. Everyday life became harder for many, and trust in leadership dwindled. Gorbachev's dilemma was that he was trying to reform socialism rather than abolish it. He wanted to create a system that was more democratic, efficient, and humane without destroying the foundations of socialism. But in reality, his reforms undermined precisely these foundations. The party lost control, the Union began to break apart, and the population believed less and less in the future of the Soviet project. In the end, there was a paradoxical picture. Gorbachev had freed the Soviet Union from its torpor, brought it new openness and international recognition. At the same time, however, he had unleashed the forces that accelerated its disintegration. Perestroika and Glasnost were attempts to save the system, but they caused it to implode.
Chapter 18: Nationality Conflicts and Processes of Disintegration. From the beginning, the Soviet Union had been a multi-ethnic state composed of dozens of republics and hundreds of ethnic groups that were held together under the leadership of Moscow. Officially, the USSR was considered a voluntary confederation of equal republics, but in fact, it was a strictly centralized state in which Russia dominated. Under Lenin, attempts had been made to respect national identities through cultural autonomy, but under Stalin at the latest, national movements had been brutally suppressed. Deportations of entire peoples, forced resettlements, and the suppression of national languages and traditions had left deep wounds. Although the republics with their flags, parliaments, and languages existed on paper, real power lay solely in Moscow. As long as the center was strong, these tensions remained suppressed. But when Gorbachev's reforms loosened the system in the 1980s, they erupted with full force and accelerated the disintegration of the Soviet Union. The first and most visible movements emerged in the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Many people there had always perceived Soviet rule as foreign rule. The memory of the independence of the interwar period was alive, as was the experience of the annexation in 1940 and the subsequent repression and deportations. As Glasnost brought more openness, civic movements emerged, such as the Sąjūdis movement in Lithuania, which openly demanded democratic reforms and eventually independence. Mass demonstrations, human chains, and symbolic actions, such as the raising of national flags, became visible signs of a new era. In August 1989, millions of people in the three Baltic states formed the so-called Baltic Chain, a human chain over 600 kilometers long from Tallinn to Vilnius, a powerful signal for the desire for freedom. Nationality conflicts also flared up in other regions of the Soviet Union. In the Caucasus, Armenians and Azerbaijanis faced each other in the dispute over the Nagorno-Karabakh region. As early as 1988, there were mass demonstrations, which soon turned into violent clashes. Pogroms, expulsions, and bloody clashes shook the region, and the central government in Moscow seemed increasingly helpless. In Georgia, mass rallies demanded more autonomy, later even independence. In Moldova, too, a movement gained influence that propagated a departure from Moscow and a rapprochement with Romania. Even within Russia, which had long been considered the stabilizing core of the Soviet Union, a new national self-assertion emerged. Figures such as Boris Yeltsin took advantage of the growing discontent to profile the Russian Soviet Republic as an independent political force. Yeltsin openly criticized the privileges of the party elite and pitted Russia's interests against those of the state as a whole. This process significantly weakened Gorbachev's authority, as he was suddenly confronted not only with separatist movements in the peripheral areas, but also with a national counterpower in the center. The nationality conflicts had several causes. On the one hand, there was the long-suppressed memory of historical independence, which was revived by Glasnost. On the other hand, the economic crisis exacerbated tensions. Many republics accused Moscow of exploiting their resources without benefiting the local population. In the Baltic states or Azerbaijan, for example, many felt economically exploited, while at the same time the supply situation deteriorated. In addition, the central structures of the party and the state lost authority, which gave local movements space to build up their own positions of power. Gorbachev first tried to save the unity of the Soviet Union through reforms. He proposed a new union treaty that would give the republics more autonomy, but at the same time preserve the state as a whole. But events overtook him. In Lithuania, the parliament unilaterally declared independence in March 1990. Moscow responded with economic pressure and military force. In January 1991, Soviet troops stormed the television tower in Vilnius, killing numerous civilians. These acts of violence shook the Soviet Union and made it clear that the will for self-determination was stronger than the threat of tanks. The clashes also escalated in other regions. In Georgia, demonstrations were bloodily suppressed, fighting broke out in Moldova, and civil war raged in Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Soviet Union, which had once presented itself as a friendship between peoples, disintegrated under the pressure of nationalistic movements and ethnic conflicts. Diversity, which had been held together by coercion for decades, broke out into open dispute. The crisis was further exacerbated by the power struggle between Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. While Gorbachev tried to preserve the state as a whole, Yeltsin relied on Russia's sovereignty. As president of the Russian Soviet Republic, he gained enormous popularity, mainly due to his appearances at mass rallies and his direct language. He skillfully exploited the discontent of the population and presented himself as an opponent of Gorbachev, who was increasingly perceived as weak and hesitant. In August 1991, the situation finally escalated. A group of conservative functionaries and military officers launched a coup attempt against Gorbachev in order to stop the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was detained in his dacha in Crimea. Tanks rolled up in Moscow. But the coup failed after a few days, not least due to the resistance of the population and the appearance of Yeltsin, who demonstratively stood on a tank and called on the people to resist. The failure of the coup effectively meant the end of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev returned to office, but his authority was destroyed. The republics now declared their independence en masse, and in December 1991, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the formal end of the Soviet Union in the so-called Belavasia agreements. The nationality conflicts and processes of disintegration of the late 1980s and early 1990s made it clear that the USSR was not so much a homogeneous state as an empire held together only by coercion and control. When this control was weakened by Gorbachev's reforms, the suppressed forces broke out. The longing for self-determination, combined with economic frustration and the failure of the center, led to the Soviet Union disintegrating at breathtaking speed. In the end, the whole tragedy of Gorbachev's reform policy became apparent. It had brought freedom but destroyed the state. The nationality conflicts were not only a side effect, but the engine of the disintegration. The multi-ethnic state gave rise to a large number of independent states whose relations with each other and with Russia are still shaped by this legacy.
Chapter 19. The End of the Soviet Union in 1991.
The year 1991 marked the final collapse of the Soviet Union, a state that had had a significant influence on world political events for more than 7 decades. The disintegration was not the result of a sudden event, but the consequence of a long development of economic stagnation, political reforms, national uprisings, and an ever-deepening loss of confidence in the leadership. But the momentum that unfolded this year was so enormous that even many contemporaries were surprised by the pace of the collapse. At the beginning of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev tried once again to save the Union. His plan was a new Union treaty that would grant the republics far-reaching autonomy but hold the state together in a loose form. Many republics signaled approval under certain conditions. But the Baltic states had already declared their independence, and in other regions the mood was increasingly directed against Moscow. The economic crisis exacerbated the situation. The supply situation was catastrophic, shelves were empty, waves of inflation made savings worthless, and the shadow economy flourished. Millions of people lost confidence in the state's ability to maintain order and security. At the same time, Boris Yeltsin became more and more important. As president of the Russian Soviet Republic, he openly opposed Gorbachev and used the discontent of the population to strengthen his own power base. Yeltsin demanded that Russia claim its sovereignty over resources, laws, and the economy. In doing so, he directly questioned the authority of the Union. While Gorbachev was still trying to save the federal structure, Yeltsin was preparing the ground for Russia's exit from the Soviet Union, which would effectively mean its end. In August 1991, the decisive turning point occurred. A group of conservative officials, military and intelligence officers tried to overthrow Gorbachev in a coup. They feared that the new Union treaty he wanted to sign would seal the disintegration, and wanted to preserve the old order by force. Gorbachev was isolated in his dacha in Crimea while tanks drove up in Moscow and the State Committee for the State of Emergency took power. But the coup failed after a few days. Hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in Moscow and other cities to demonstrate against the coup plotters. Symbolically, Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank in front of the Russian parliament and called on the population to resist. The coup plotters were divided, their measures half-hearted, and without broad support, their plan quickly fell apart. The failed coup decisively weakened Gorbachev and strengthened Yeltsin. Although Gorbachev formally returned to office, he had lost his authority. Many republics took the opportunity to declare or consolidate their independence. In Ukraine, the population voted overwhelmingly for independence in a referendum in December 1991. Other republics also followed suit. The dream of a reformed union had thus finally failed. On December 8, 1991, the presidents of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, in a hunting lodge in Belavezha, Belarus. This agreement was concluded without Gorbachev's participation and made his role as president of the Union practically obsolete. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev officially resigned, declaring that his office as president of the Soviet Union no longer existed. That same evening, the red flag with hammer and sickle was lowered over the Kremlin and replaced by the Russian tricolor. This sealed the end of a state that had once been an empire, a superpower, and an ideological countermodel to the West. The end of the Soviet Union was accompanied by deep feelings of insecurity and upheaval. Many people felt relief because they now believed that freedom and democracy would become possible. Others suffered from the loss of security, stability, and identity. The collapse of the old system did not bring an immediate improvement in everyday life, but led to chaos, economic decline, and new conflicts. In Russia itself, a difficult transformation towards a market economy and democracy began, marked by corruption, oligarchism, and poverty. In the newly formed states, very different paths developed.
Some aspired to the West, others remained closely tied to Russia, and still others sank into conflicts. For world politics, the collapse of the Soviet Union meant a tectonic shift. The Cold War, which had divided the world into two blocks for 4 decades, had ended. The United States remained the only superpower, while Russia and the other successor states had to find their place in a new international order. Europe changed fundamentally. NATO and the European Union expanded their influence eastward, while the former Soviet sphere of influence strove for independence. In retrospect, the year 1991 appears to be a moment of world historic significance. The Soviet dream of a socialist empire that would be an alternative to capitalism had collapsed. The causes lay in economic weaknesses, national conflicts, the rigidity of the political system, and the pressure of reforms which destroyed more than they saved. But the dynamics of personalities also played a role. Gorbachev as a reformer who acted too late and too cautiously, and Yeltsin as a populist leader who accelerated the disintegration. The end of the Soviet Union in 1991 was both an end and a beginning. It ended the existence of one of the most powerful states in history, but it also opened a new era, the consequences of which are still felt today. The decay brought freedom, but also uncertainty, hope, but also suffering. For millions of people, it was a deep cut in their lives, a break with the past that meant both liberation and loss.
Chapter 20. Aftermath and Historical Assessment. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was one of the most significant events of the 20th century. It ended not only the existence of a state that had determined the fate of a sixth of the Earth's surface for over 7 decades, but also an epoch in world history that had been marked by the ideological and geopolitical antagonism between East and West. In one fell swoop, a superpower that had supported the Cold War for decades, controlled colonies of satellite states, and determined the fate of millions of people, disappeared. But the end of the Soviet Union was not only a geopolitical event, but also a profound social, cultural, and psychological earthquake, the aftermath of which is still felt today. For the immediate successor states, the end of the USSR meant an abrupt transition to a new reality. Russia itself, the largest and most influential legacy, has had to redefine itself in a painful process. The claim to be the center of a world empire and an equal rival of the USA was lost. The 1990s in Russia were marked by chaos, economic decline, and political experiments. Millions of people lost their jobs, their savings were wiped out by hyperinflation, and everyday life was marked by uncertainty. At the same time, new freedoms opened up. The press, culture, and politics were suddenly less controlled. Travel abroad became possible, and the country underwent a radical transformation. But many did not perceive this change as a liberation, but as a collapse of the usual order. The upheaval was also profound in the other former Soviet republics. The Baltic states oriented themselves decisively towards the West, aspired to join NATO and the European Union, and found new security and prospects in them. In Central Asia, on the other hand, authoritarian regimes often established themselves that relied on old structures and used the change of power to establish national autocracy. In Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, conflicts over territories flared up, some of which continue to this day. The collapse of the Soviet Union also meant the breaking up of old ethnic and cultural antagonisms that had been suppressed by Moscow for decades. Internationally, the end of the USSR led to the end of the Cold War and the creation of a new world order. The United States was left as the only superpower, claiming leadership in a unipolar world. Many in the West celebrated the event as a victory of freedom and proof of the superiority of democracy and the market economy. The illusion of the end of history, espoused by authors such as Francis Fukuyama, emerged. The idea that liberal democracies and capitalism would now gain a foothold worldwide as a universal model. But the reality turned out to be more complex. The historical assessment of the Soviet Union itself is still controversial today.
On the one hand, it is considered a state of oppression which cost millions of people their lives through terror, famine, and political purges. The crimes under Stalin, the gulags, the deportations of entire peoples, censorship, and the lack of freedom are undisputed parts of its history. At the same time, however, many recall the achievements: the industrialization of a backward country, the overcoming of illiteracy, victory in the Second World War, and the role as a counterweight to Western imperialism. The social advancement of many people who received free education, medical care, and a certain social security is also highlighted by some as a positive side. The Soviet Union was therefore a state full of contradictions. On the one hand, it was a project of enormous ambition that wanted to change the world. And on the other hand, it was a system that entangled itself in contradictions. It was a source of hope for left-wing movements worldwide, at the same time an example of repression and deprivation of liberty. It offered its citizens security, but also narrowness, equality, but also scarcity. It is precisely this ambivalence that makes the evaluation so difficult and multi-layered. The aftermath is still felt today. Russia under Vladimir Putin consciously sees itself as the successor to the Soviet Union and ties in with symbols, traditions, and myths that originate from the Soviet era. Victory in the Great Patriotic War remains the central point of reference for national identity. The memory of the Soviet Union as a great power also shapes the self-image of many Russians, who perceive the collapse as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, as Putin once put it. In many successor states, the relationship to the Soviet era remains divided, partly nostalgia for stability, partly bitter memory of oppression and loss. At the global level, the collapse of the USSR led to a shift in the balance of power, the consequences of which are still not fully foreseeable. Without the bipolar order of the Cold War, many countries lost their orientation. Alliances changed, conflicts broke out that had previously been controlled by the two superpowers. NATO's influence grew while Russia looked for new ways to assert its place. The world order became more unstable, multipolar, and less predictable. The historical assessment of the Soviet Union also depends on the perspective one takes. From a Western perspective, it is often seen as a failed experiment that ended in dictatorship and economic bankruptcy. From the point of view of many former Soviet citizens, on the other hand, it was home, workplace, everyday life, identity. Millions associated with memories of their youth, of community, of pride, and scientific and cultural achievements. This subjective dimension explains why nostalgia for the Soviet era is still widespread in many regions today. In the end, it remains to be said that the Soviet Union played a central role in the history of the 20th century. It was an engine of progress and oppression at the same time, a beacon of hope and a boogeyman, a competitor of the West and at the same time part of the same modern world. Its end had become inevitable because the internal contradictions were too great, the reforms came too late, and the forces of disintegration were stronger than those of cohesion. But their legacy remains alive in politics, society, culture, and memory. The aftermath of the Soviet Union is therefore not only a historical chapter, but part of the present. Their rise, their blossoming, and their fall are lessons in how great ideas can fail in the face of reality, how power first strengthens and then paralyzes systems, and how peoples find their own voice again in the midst of upheaval. The Soviet Union may have disappeared, but it continues to have an effect, as a memory, as a warning, and as part of the world we live in today.